Vanishing of Eilean Mòr Lighthouse Mystery Unpacked December 26, 1900. Boxing Day morning dawned gray and unforgiving across the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, where the Hebrides scattered like ancient sentinels guarding Scotland's western edge. Captain James Harvey squinted through the salt-stained windows of the steamship archdoor, his weathered hands gripping the wheel as he navigated the familiar shipping lanes toward Leith Harbor. But something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong. For 15 nights, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse had failed to cast its life-saving beam across these murderous waters. 15 nights of darkness, where there should have been light. 15 nights of ships groping blindly through channels that had claimed countless vessels before the lighthouse's construction just 1 year prior. The absence of that beacon wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence, waiting to be served to any captain unlucky enough to encounter these waters in a storm. Captain Harvey wasn't the first to notice the darkness. Passing vessels had been reporting the lighthouse's silence since December 15th, their wireless operators crackling urgent messages to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. Each report carried the same chilling message. The newest, most advanced lighthouse in Scotland's fleet had simply stopped working. No distress signals. No emergency flares. No communication whatsoever from the 3 experienced keepers stationed on that isolated chunk of rock 40 miles from the nearest inhabited land. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse represented the pinnacle of maritime safety technology. Standing 75 feet tall on Eilean Mòr, the largest of the 7 uninhabited islands that comprise the Flannans, it had been designed to withstand the worst the North Atlantic could deliver. Its Chance Brothers lens, imported from Birmingham at enormous expense, could project a beam visible for 24 nautical miles. The lighthouse was equipped with the most modern oil-burning system available, tended by 3 of the Northern Lighthouse Board's most reliable keepers, working in careful rotation. These weren't novice lighthouse men prone to abandoning their posts. James Duckett, the principal keeper, had served with distinction for over 2 decades across Scotland's most challenging lighthouse stations. Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur, his assistants, were equally experienced professionals who understood that their vigilance meant the difference between life and death for countless sailors navigating these waters. Men like these didn't simply disappear. They didn't abandon their sacred duty to keep the light burning. They understood that ships' captains trusted their beacon with precious cargo and irreplaceable lives. Yet here was Captain Harvey on the morning after Christmas, staring across 24 miles of empty water where a lighthouse beam should have been cutting through the winter darkness. The silence from Eilean Mòr had stretched beyond any reasonable explanation. Equipment failures happened, certainly, but backup systems existed. Emergency procedures were in place. The Northern Lighthouse Board had designed multiple redundancies specifically to prevent this scenario. A lighthouse going dark without warning, without explanation, without any communication from its keepers. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Something had happened on that remote island, something that would soon reveal itself as one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. The wind picked up across the Arctur's deck as Captain Harvey adjusted his course, the winter morning carrying whispers of the storm that would soon engulf the entire region. Somewhere ahead in the gray distance, Eilean Mòr waited with its secrets, its silent lighthouse tower standing like a tombstone against the slate sky. 3 men had vanished from what should have been an impregnable fortress of stone and steel, leaving behind only questions that would echo across more than a century. Time was running out for answers, and the December darkness was only beginning. 7 miles long and barely a mile wide at its broadest point, Eilean Mòr rises from the North Atlantic like the spine of some prehistoric beast, its cliffs carved by millennia of relentless waves and howling winds. The largest of the Flannan Isles, this remote outpost sits 43 miles west of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, so isolated that on clear days the lighthouse keepers could see nothing but endless ocean stretching toward the horizon where America waited 3,000 miles away. The island's Gaelic name translates simply as Big Island, but locals had long called the Flannans by another name, the 7 Hunters. Ancient Celtic legends spoke of these islands as cursed places where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits grew thin. Fishermen from Lewis and Harris whispered stories, passed down through generations, about boats that approached the Flannans only to find their crews struck by sudden madness, about lights seen dancing across the islands when no human souls should have been present, about voices carried on the wind speaking in tongues no living person could understand. For centuries, the Flannans had remained uninhabited by choice rather than circumstance. The soil was thin and rocky, unsuitable for agriculture. Fresh water existed only in seasonal streams that dried to nothing during summer months. The islands offered no natural harbors, no protection from the storms that swept across the Atlantic with devastating regularity. Even the hardiest Hebridean crofters, accustomed to wresting survival from Scotland's most unforgiving landscapes, had given the Flannans a wide berth. Yet it was precisely this desolation that made Eilean Mòr perfect for the Northern Lighthouse Board's purposes. Ships traveling between Scotland and the Americas had been wrecked on these waters for centuries, their masters unable to fix their position in the darkness. The board's engineers had identified the highest point of Eilean Mòr as the ideal location for a lighthouse that could warn vessels away from the treacherous reefs and guide them safely through the shipping channels that funneled maritime traffic toward the Scottish mainland. Construction had begun in 1895. A monumental undertaking that required transporting every brick, every piece of steel, every tool and supply by ship from the mainland. The builders worked in shifts, living in temporary barracks erected near the construction site, racing against time and weather to complete their work before the brutal winter storms made further progress impossible. Supply ships could only reach the island during brief windows of calm weather, sometimes leaving the construction crews isolated for weeks at a time. The lighthouse tower itself was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, built to withstand winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and waves that could crash over cliffs standing 200 feet above sea level. The structure rose 75 feet from a base carved directly into the island's bedrock, its walls tapering from 8 feet thick at the foundation to 4 feet at the lamp room. Every stone had been precisely cut and fitted using techniques perfected across decades of lighthouse construction throughout the British Isles. Adjacent to the tower, the engineers constructed a complex of living quarters and work buildings designed to house 3 lighthouse keepers in relative comfort despite their isolation. The compound included separate sleeping quarters for each keeper, a communal kitchen and dining area, storage rooms for oil and provisions, workshops for equipment maintenance, and a small library stocked with books donated by the Northern Lighthouse Board. A concrete landing platform was blasted from the cliff face, connected to the lighthouse compound by a steep railway track that allowed supplies to be hauled up from the sea. By December 1899, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was operational, its powerful beams sweeping across 24 nautical miles of treacherous water every night. The 3 keepers assigned to the station represented the Northern Lighthouse Board's most experienced personnel, men who understood that their vigilance protected not just individual ships, but the entire flow of commerce between Scotland and the wider world. Principal Keeper James Duckett had specifically requested assignment to Eilean Mòr despite its reputation for isolation and harsh conditions. At 43, he possessed 2 decades of lighthouse experience and a reputation for maintaining perfect operational records even during the worst weather conditions. His wife had grown accustomed to his long absences at remote stations, understanding that his dedication to the service meant months of separation punctuated by brief reunions when supply ships allowed. The island that had waited empty for millennia now hummed with human purpose, its lighthouse beam cutting through darkness that had claimed countless lives. Yet the same isolation that made Eilean Mòr perfect for lighthouse operations also made it the ideal setting for a mystery that would confound investigators for generations. James Duckett stood at the lamp room's curved windows on the evening of December 7, 1900, watching the Atlantic swells build into the massive formations that signaled an approaching winter storm. At 43, he possessed the weathered features and steady demeanor of a man who had spent half his life battling the elements at Scotland's most remote lighthouse stations. His logbook entries, written in precise copperplate handwriting, recorded wind speeds, weather conditions, and equipment status with the methodical accuracy that had earned him promotion to principal keeper across multiple postings. Duckett had volunteered for the Flannan Isles assignment despite its notorious reputation for isolation. His wife Mary understood that her husband's dedication to lighthouse service meant accepting long separations, sometimes extending to months, when winter storms prevented supply ships from reaching the most remote stations. She had learned to manage their household and Stromness alone, raising their children, while James maintained his vigil against the darkness that claimed ships and lives with indifferent regularity. The principal keeper took pride in running what the Northern Lighthouse Board considered one of its most efficient operations. Every piece of equipment received daily inspection and maintenance. Oil levels were monitored and recorded with scientific precision. The massive Fresnel lens was cleaned and adjusted to ensure maximum beam intensity. Under Duckett's supervision, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse had achieved a perfect operational record since beginning service. Not a single night of darkness. Not a single failure to provide the life-saving guidance that ships traveling these waters demanded. Working alongside Duckett were two assistant keepers whose experience and reliability matched his own. Thomas Marshall, 28 years old and originally from Lewis, brought intimate knowledge of Hebridean weather patterns and sea conditions. His ability to read approaching storms often gave the lighthouse crew precious hours to secure equipment and prepare for the worst conditions the Atlantic could deliver. Marshall's family waited for him in Stornoway, where his wife tended their small children and counted the days until his next scheduled leave. Donald MacArthur, the senior assistant keeper, had served at lighthouse stations throughout the Scottish Islands for 15 years. At 35, he possessed the technical expertise to repair virtually any equipment failure and the physical strength to handle the demanding manual labor that lighthouse operations required. MacArthur's wife lived in relative comfort in Oban, supported by steady lighthouse wages and the knowledge that her husband's skill and experience made him one of the service's most valued personnel. The three men operated on a carefully coordinated schedule designed to ensure continuous lighthouse operation, regardless of weather conditions or individual emergencies. While one keeper maintained the lamp and monitored weather conditions, the others handled cooking, cleaning, equipment maintenance, and the countless small tasks required to sustain human life in one of Scotland's most isolated locations. They rotated duties according to a strict timetable, ensuring that no single person bore excessive responsibility while maintaining the redundancy that lighthouse operations demanded. Their living quarters reflected the Northern Lighthouse Board's understanding that keeper morale directly affected operational efficiency. Each man possessed a private room furnished with a comfortable bed, writing desk, and storage for personal belongings. The communal areas included a well-equipped kitchen, dining room with space for all three keepers, and a sitting room stocked with books, games, and writing materials. Oil lamps provided adequate lighting during the long winter nights, while a coal-burning stove maintained comfortable temperatures even during the most severe weather. Communication with the mainland occurred through a complex system of flag signals and lamp codes that allowed the keepers to request supplies, report equipment problems, or signal emergencies to passing ships. Supply vessels arrived every 2 weeks during favorable weather, bringing fresh food, oil for the lighthouse lamp, mail from families, and newspapers that provided the keepers only connection to events in the wider world. During winter months, these supply runs became increasingly irregular as storms made approaching the islands exposed landing platform too dangerous to attempt. The isolation that defined lighthouse service attracted men of particular temperament, those who found satisfaction in solitary work, who could maintain mental stability during weeks of human contact limited to 2 companions, who possessed the emotional resilience to function effectively despite separation from family and community. Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur represented the ideal lighthouse crew. Experienced professionals who understood their responsibilities, compatible personalities who could work together harmoniously in confined spaces, skilled technicians capable of maintaining complex equipment under difficult conditions. Yet even the most experienced lighthouse keepers remained vulnerable to the unpredictable forces that ruled these remote waters. The same isolation that made their vigilance essential also meant that when disaster struck, help might be days or weeks away. On Eilean Mòr, 3 men stood against the gathering darkness of December 1900, unaware that they were about to become central figures in a mystery that would outlast their own lives by more than a century. The barometer in the lighthouse's instrument room began its ominous descent on December 12, 1900, dropping steadily as Principal Keeper James Duckett recorded the readings in his meticulous logbook. Outside the lamp room's thick glass windows, the Atlantic had transformed from its usual restless gray into something far more sinister. Massive swells rolling in from the northwest, their crests beginning to break into the white foam that warned of approaching violence. Duckett had witnessed countless storms during his 2 decades of lighthouse service, but the atmospheric pressure readings told a story that made even his experienced nerves tighten. This wasn't merely another winter gale sweeping across the Hebrides. The meteorological signs pointed toward something far more destructive, a cyclonic storm system of unusual intensity, the kind that occurred perhaps once in a decade and left devastation across hundreds of miles of Scottish coastline. Thomas Marshall joined his principal keeper at the lamp room windows as the afternoon light began to fade, both men studying the sea conditions with the practiced eye of professional mariners. The wave patterns had shifted dramatically since morning, the usual confused chop giving way to the long, deep swells that indicated massive disturbances far out in the Atlantic. These weren't local weather effects, they were the advance messengers of a storm system that had been building power across thousands of miles of open ocean. "It'll be a bad one," Marshall observed quietly, his Lewis accent carrying the understated tone that Hebridean islanders used when discussing whether that could kill. He had grown up reading these waters, understanding their moods and dangers, with intuitive knowledge passed down through generations of seafaring ancestors. The signs were unmistakable: wind direction shifting to the northwest, cloud formations building into the towering walls that preceded the most severe Atlantic storms, seabirds abandoning their usual feeding grounds to seek shelter in the island's limited protected areas. Donald MacArthur emerged from the equipment rooms below, carrying the tools and spare parts they would need if the storm damaged any of the lighthouse's critical systems. His 15 years of experience had taught him that preparation meant the difference between weathering a storm successfully and facing catastrophic equipment failure when replacement parts might be weeks away. Every piece of mechanical equipment received final inspection and adjustment. Oil reservoirs were topped off to ensure continuous lamp operation regardless of how long the storm might last. Emergency supplies were moved to easily accessible locations. The 3 keepers understood their responsibilities with absolute clarity. No matter what violence nature unleashed against their lighthouse, the beam must continue to sweep across these treacherous waters. Ships might be fighting for their lives in conditions that made navigation nearly impossible, their masters desperately seeking any reference point that could guide them away from the reefs and rocks that had claimed vessels for centuries. The lighthouse represented their only hope of survival, and the keeper's sacred duty was to ensure that hope never flickered or died. By evening, the wind had increased to gale force, howling around the lighthouse tower with a sound like tortured souls crying for mercy. The massive stone structure, built to withstand precisely these conditions, stood firm against the assault, but the noise was deafening even inside the thick-walled living quarters. Conversation became difficult, then impossible, as the storm's voice rose to a shriek that seemed to penetrate stone and steel with equal ease. Outside, waves that had measured 12 feet in the afternoon now towered 20 feet above their troughs, their foam-streaked faces illuminated in ghostly white whenever the lighthouse beam swept across them. The landing platform where supply ships normally docked disappeared entirely beneath surging water, the concrete structure submerged under tons of Atlantic fury that would have crushed any vessel foolish enough to attempt an approach. MacArthur checked the lighthouse lamp every hour, ensuring that the oil flow remained steady and the lens rotation continued with clockwork precision. The beam's regular sweep became their lifeline to normalcy, its reliable rhythm providing psychological anchor against the chaos raging outside their walls. As long as the light continued to function, they were fulfilling their purpose, maintaining their watch against the darkness that sought to claim both ships and souls. The storm's intensity continued building throughout the night, reaching levels that exceeded even the most pessimistic forecasts. Wind speeds climbed past 70 miles per hour, then 80, driving spray and foam hundreds of feet above sea level. The lighthouse shuddered under the impact of waves that struck with the force of artillery shells, each blow testing the engineering and construction that had seemed so robust during calmer conditions. By dawn on December 13th, the three keepers found themselves facing weather conditions that challenged the very limits of human endurance and architectural strength. They had no way of knowing that this storm would be remembered as one of the most violent in recorded Scottish maritime history, or that their lighthouse would soon become the center of a mystery that would baffle investigators for generations. Captain Jim Harvey guided the lighthouse tender Hesperus through the gradually calming seas toward Eilean Mòr on the morning of December 26, 1900, his weathered hand steady on the wheel despite the knot of unease growing in his stomach. For 11 days, no signal had come from the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, no flag communications, no lamp signals, no response to the increasingly urgent wireless messages crackling between ships throughout the Hebrides. The silence from that remote outpost had stretched beyond any reasonable explanation into something that felt distinctly ominous. Harvey had been making supply runs to Scotland's most isolated lighthouse stations for over a decade, and he understood the rhythms and requirements of lighthouse operations with intimate precision. Equipment failures happened, certainly, but backup systems existed specifically to prevent extended blackouts. Emergency protocols required keepers to signal passing ships if primary systems failed. The Northern Lighthouse Board had designed multiple redundancies to ensure that a lighthouse never went dark without warning, without explanation, without any communication from its crew. Yet here was the Hesperus approaching Eilean Mòr after nearly 2 weeks of absolute silence, the lighthouse tower standing dark and motionless against the winter sky. No figures moved on the landing platform. No smoke rose from the living quarters chimneys. The flagpole stood empty when regulations required daily flag displays to indicate station status. The entire lighthouse compound appeared as lifeless as the barren rock on which it was built. Accompanying Harvey was Joseph Moore, an occasional keeper dispatched by the Northern Lighthouse Board to investigate the communication breakdown and provide temporary relief if needed. Moore possessed extensive lighthouse experience and had served at multiple remote stations throughout the Scottish Islands. He understood that equipment problems or keeper illness could explain temporary communication lapses, but the extended silence from Eilean Mòr suggested something far more serious than routine operational difficulties. The Hesperus navigated carefully through the treacherous waters surrounding the Flannans, approaching the concrete landing platform that had been blasted from the cliff face during the lighthouse's construction. Even in the relatively calm conditions following the recent storm, waves still surged against the platform with enough force to make docking dangerous. Harvey waited for the optimal moment between swells, then guided his vessel alongside the platform with the precision that years of experience had taught him. Moore leaped onto the concrete platform as soon as the Hesperus drew close enough, carrying the mail pouch and supplies that should have been delivered 2 weeks earlier. His boots echoed hollowly on the empty platform as he secured the ship's mooring lines, the sound emphasizing the unnatural silence that surrounded the lighthouse compound. Where were the keepers who should have been waiting to help with unloading? Where were the voices calling greetings and questions about news from the mainland? The railway track that connected the landing platform to the lighthouse compound stretched up the cliff face like a steel ladder. Empty rail cars waiting at the bottom to transport supplies to the living quarters above. Moore began the steep climb, his unease growing with every step as the silence pressed around him like a physical weight. The lighthouse tower loomed ahead, its lamp room dark behind glass that should have been gleaming with reflected light. Reaching the lighthouse compound, Moore immediately noticed details that made his experienced lighthouse keeper's instincts sound urgent alarms. The main door to the living quarters stood closed but unlocked, a violation of basic security protocols that no experienced keeper would commit. The flagpole remained empty when regulations required daily displays. No smoke rose from chimneys that should have been burning constantly during December's bitter cold. Moore called out as he approached the main building, his voice echoing off stone walls and receiving no response except the whisper of wind through empty doorways. He pushed open the main door and stepped into the communal living area, finding it neat and orderly but completely deserted. Breakfast dishes sat unwashed in the kitchen sink. Coals in the stove had burned down to cold ash days or weeks earlier. The silence inside the building felt even more oppressive than the emptiness outside. Moving through the living quarters, with increasing urgency, Mòr searched each room systematically. The keeper's individual sleeping quarters showed signs of normal occupancy. Personal belongings arranged as expected, beds made according to lighthouse regulations, clothing hung in wardrobes with military precision. Nothing suggested hurried departure or signs of struggle. The men appeared to have simply vanished, leaving behind all their possessions and abandoning their sacred duty to maintain the lighthouse beam. In the lamp room at the lighthouse tower summit, Mòr discovered that the massive oil-burning apparatus had been properly extinguished and secured, following correct procedures for shutting down operations. This wasn't equipment failure or accidental extinguishing. Someone had deliberately turned off the lighthouse, following protocols that only experienced keepers would know. Yet there was no logbook entry explaining this action. No official record of why 3 professional lighthouse men would abandon their post. Mòr's hands trembled as he reached for the signal lamp to flash an urgent message toward the Hesperus waiting below. A dreadful accident has happened. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional have disappeared from the island. Joseph Mòr's footsteps echoed through the abandoned lighthouse quarters as he began his systematic examination of each room, searching for any clue that might explain how 3 experienced men could vanish without trace from what should have been an impregnable stone fortress. The silence pressed against him like a living thing, broken only by the distant crash of waves against Eilean Mòr's cliffs and the whisper of wind through empty doorways. In the communal kitchen, Mòr discovered the first tangible evidence of when the keepers had last been present. 2 chairs lay overturned beside the dining table, their positions suggesting hasty departure rather than careful arrangement. A half-eaten meal remained on one plate, bread that had hardened to stone consistency, cheese that had developed a coating of green mold, tea that had evaporated to leave dark stains in the bottom of ceramic cups. The scene suggested that whoever had been eating here had been interrupted suddenly, abandoning their food mid-meal. The kitchen clock had stopped at precisely 3:17, though whether morning or afternoon remained unclear. Its hands pointed accusingly at numbers that might represent the exact moment when normal life had ceased in this remote outpost. Mòr wound the mechanism carefully, listening to its resumed ticking as the only sound of human activity in rooms that had contained 3 living men just days or weeks earlier. Moving to Principal Keeper James Ducat's private quarters, Mòr found everything arranged with the methodical precision he expected from a 20-year veteran of lighthouse service. Ducat's personal logbook lay open on his writing desk, the final entry dated December 13th, and recording weather conditions in the same meticulous handwriting that characterized all his official reports. The entry noted severe winds from northwest, sea visibility poor due to spray, lamp functioning normally despite difficult conditions. Nothing in Ducat's final logbook entry suggested unusual circumstances or developing emergency. His handwriting remained steady and controlled, his weather observations factual and professional. The entry concluded with the standard notation that all equipment was functioning properly, and the lighthouse beam remained operational. Yet this was the last official record of any keeper's presence on Eilean Mòr. Ducat's personal belongings remained exactly where regulations required them to be stored. His spare clothing hung neatly in the wardrobe, his shaving kit arranged precisely on the washstand, his small collection of books stacked according to size on the shelf beside his bed. A letter from his wife Mary lay partially written on his desk, the ink still wet enough to smear when Mòr accidentally brushed it with his sleeve. The letter spoke of ordinary domestic matters, children's health, household expenses, plans for James's next scheduled leave. Thomas Marshall's quarters told a similar story of interrupted normal routine. The young assistant keeper's room showed signs of recent occupancy, but no indication of hasty departure or emergency evacuation. His oilskin weather gear hung on its designated hook, though regulations required keepers to wear protective clothing when venturing outside during severe weather. His personal effects remained undisturbed, including a small wooden carving he had been working on during off-duty hours, a model fishing boat that remained half-finished on his workbench. Most puzzling was Marshall's unfinished letter to his wife in Stornoway, abandoned mid-sentence, with the pen still lying beside the ink bottle. The letter described the recent storm in vivid detail, noting how waves had overtopped the lighthouse platform and spray had reached heights he had never witnessed before. His final written words were ominous. "The sea has been getting worse and worse, and I fear we will not be able to." The sentence ended abruptly. The pen apparently dropped in the middle of forming the next word. Donald MacArthur's room presented the most disturbing evidence of all. The senior assistant keeper's quarters showed signs of systematic preparation, as though he had been making ready for some anticipated event. His tools were cleaned and arranged with unusual care, his equipment organized according to emergency protocols. Most significantly, his heavy weather gear was missing from its designated storage location, suggesting he had dressed for severe conditions before whatever happened to him occurred. In the lighthouse's equipment rooms, Mòr discovered that all mechanical systems had been properly secured according to standard procedures. The lamp mechanism showed signs of recent maintenance, with oil levels topped off and all moving parts recently lubricated. Emergency supplies remained intact and properly stored. Nothing suggested equipment failure or operational crisis that might have required immediate evacuation. The compound's logbook, separate from individual keeper records, contained Duckett's final official entry dated December 15th. This entry recorded completion of routine maintenance tasks and noted that all three keepers remained healthy and operational. The entry concluded with the standard phrase, "All well." Light burning bright. Yet from that date forward, the lighthouse had remained dark, its beam no longer sweeping across waters where ships depended on its guidance for survival. Mòr completed his systematic search as afternoon shadows began lengthening across Eilean Mòr's barren landscape. 3 men had vanished from these rooms, leaving behind all their possessions, abandoning their sacred duty, disappearing without explanation from an island surrounded by 40 miles of treacherous water. The lighthouse stood as a monument to their absence, its dark tower bearing silent witness to a mystery that defied rational explanation. The Northern Lighthouse Board's investigation into the Flannan Isles disappearance began within hours of Joseph Mòr's shocking discovery, but the explanations proposed by officials seemed to raise more questions than they answered. Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrived on Eilean Mòr aboard the lighthouse tender just 2 days after Mòr's initial report, bringing with him a team of experienced investigators and the board's determination to solve what was rapidly becoming their most baffling case. Muirhead's preliminary examination of the lighthouse compound revealed disturbing details that Mòr's initial search had missed. The main gate leading to the lighthouse platform showed evidence of damage, not from storm conditions, but from what appeared to be enormous impact forces. Iron railings designed to withstand hurricane-force winds were bent and twisted, their metal deformed in ways that suggested they had been struck by objects weighing several tons and moving at tremendous velocity. The concrete landing platform itself bore scars that defied easy explanation. Deep gouges carved into the reinforced surface suggested that something massive had scraped across the platform with enough force to carve channels in concrete that had been designed to resist decades of storm damage. Yet no debris remained to indicate what might have caused such destruction, and the gouges followed no pattern that natural forces would create. Most puzzling were the missing oilskin coats. Donald MacArthur's heavy weather gear had vanished from its storage location, suggesting he had dressed for severe conditions before leaving the lighthouse compound. Yet both James Duckett's and Thomas Marshall's protective clothing remained hanging in their designated places, indicating they had ventured outside without proper gear despite regulations that strictly forbade such behavior during storm conditions. The board's meteorological consultants reconstructed weather conditions during the critical period between December 13th and 15th, revealing that the storm which had battered the Flannans during those days ranked among the most severe on record. Wind speeds had exceeded 90 miles per hour, with wave heights reaching levels that could have overtopped cliffs standing 200 feet above normal sea level. Under such conditions, any person caught outside the lighthouse's protective walls would have faced almost certain death. Yet this explanation raised immediate contradictions. If the keepers had been swept away by storm conditions, why would 2 of them have ventured outside without protective clothing? Why would experienced lighthouse men abandon their posts during the worst weather they had ever encountered? Why would they risk their lives for any reason when their primary duty was maintaining the lighthouse beam that ships desperately needed during the storm. Alternative theories emerged as investigators struggled to reconcile the evidence with known facts about lighthouse operations and the character of the missing men. Some officials suggested that the keepers might have attempted to secure equipment on the landing platform, only to be overwhelmed by waves of unprecedented size. This explanation would account for MacArthur's missing weather gear and the damage to the platform railings, but it failed to explain why all three men would have engaged in such a dangerous operation simultaneously. Others proposed that the keepers had spotted a ship in distress and attempted a rescue operation, abandoning the lighthouse to save lives at sea. This theory aligned with the humanitarian instincts that lighthouse men were expected to possess, but it contradicted fundamental training that forbade keepers from leaving their posts under any circumstances. The lighthouse beam represented the primary life-saving tool at their disposal. Abandoning it to attempt direct rescue would have endangered far more lives than it might save. A more disturbing theory emerged from examination of the lighthouse's official records and the keeper's personal effects. Some investigators noted that the isolation of lighthouse duty sometimes produced psychological effects in even the most stable individuals. Months of confinement with the same companions, separated from family and normal social contact, occasionally resulted in mental breakdown or violent confrontation between keepers. Could some form of madness have overtaken the Flannan Isles crew? This psychological explanation gained support from Thomas Marshall's unfinished letter, which described increasingly severe weather conditions in terms that some readers interpreted as showing unusual emotional distress. His final written words, "The sea has been getting worse and worse, and I fear we will not be able to," might have indicated growing panic rather than simple concern about storm conditions. Yet the physical evidence contradicted theories of violence or mental breakdown among the keepers. No signs of struggle appeared anywhere in the lighthouse compound. Personal belongings remained undisturbed and properly arranged. The lighthouse equipment had been secured according to proper procedures, suggesting that whoever had extinguished the lamp had followed correct protocols, rather than acting in panic or rage. What's your take on this case? The Northern Lighthouse Board's investigation would continue for months, generating reports and testimonies that filled hundreds of pages without reaching any definitive conclusion. Each theory that emerged seemed to explain some aspects of the mystery while creating new contradictions that defied resolution. The Flannan Isles disappearance was transforming from a simple missing persons case into something far more complex and disturbing. Superintendent Muirhead's final report would acknowledge the investigation's failure to determine exactly what had happened to Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur. The three keepers had vanished as completely as if the Atlantic had simply swallowed them whole, leaving behind only questions that would echo across generations. The Atlantic Ocean guards its secrets jealously, but the water surrounding the Flannan Isles began yielding fragmentary evidence in the days following the discovery of the empty lighthouse compound. Search vessels dispatched by the Northern Lighthouse Board combed the treacherous channels between the seven islands, their crews scanning the surface for any trace of the three missing keepers or clues to their fate. Captain Harvey of the Hesperus reported the first significant finding on December 29th, when his crew discovered a wooden crate floating approximately 2 miles southeast of Eilean Mòr. The waterlogged container bore the Northern Lighthouse Board's official markings and had clearly come from the lighthouse's supply stores. Inside, searchers found emergency provisions that should have remained secure in the compound storage rooms: hardtack biscuits, tins of preserved meat, and medical supplies that regulations required to be kept readily accessible for emergency situations. The crate's condition told a story of violent displacement. Its wooden sides showed deep gouges and impact damage consistent with being hurled against stone surfaces with tremendous force. Metal reinforcing straps had been bent and twisted beyond their normal breaking point. Most tellingly, the crate's contents were arranged in the haphazard fashion that would result from being tumbled through surf, rather than the careful packing that lighthouse supply protocols demanded. More disturbing discoveries followed as search operations expanded to cover the wider area around the Flannans. Fragments of yellow oilskin cloth were recovered from rocks on the smaller islands, the waterproof fabric torn into strips that suggested violent contact with sharp stone surfaces. The cloth matched the regulation protective gear issued to lighthouse keepers, but the pieces were too small and damaged to determine which of the three men might have worn the destroyed garment. A fishing boat from Lewis reported finding a wooden bench floating in the shipping lanes between the Flannans and the Scottish mainland, its construction matching furniture from the lighthouse's communal living areas. The bench showed impact damage severe enough to split the solid oak planking, suggesting it had been subjected to forces that no indoor furniture should ever encounter. How such a heavy piece of furniture had traveled from the lighthouse compound to open water remained inexplicable. The most chilling discovery came from local fishermen, who had been working the waters around the Flannans since childhood. These men, intimately familiar with normal tidal patterns and debris distribution in the area, reported finding objects in locations that defied oceanographic explanation. Items that should have drifted southeast with prevailing currents were discovered on shores facing northwest. Debris that should have sunk in the deep waters surrounding the islands was washing up on beaches where shallow coastal currents would never carry such materials. Marine experts consulted by the Northern Lighthouse Board confirmed that the debris pattern suggested a catastrophic event rather than gradual displacement of lighthouse materials. The scattered objects appeared to have been ejected from Eilean Mòr simultaneously and with tremendous force, then distributed by tidal action across an area spanning nearly 20 square miles. Such distribution would require explosive forces or wave action of unprecedented magnitude. Weather records from the critical period provided context that was both illuminating and puzzling. The storm that had battered the Flannans between December 13th and 15th had indeed generated wave heights and wind speeds approaching the theoretical limits for North Atlantic conditions. Meteorologists calculated that waves exceeding 50 feet in height might have struck the lighthouse compound, carrying enough energy to move objects weighing several tons. Yet even these extreme conditions failed to fully explain the evidence pattern. The lighthouse had been designed and built to withstand precisely such storms, with safety margins that should have protected both the structure and its occupants from even the worst weather the Atlantic could deliver. The concrete platform and reinforced buildings represented state-of-the-art engineering specifically intended to resist hurricane force conditions. More puzzling were reports from other lighthouse stations throughout the Hebrides, all of which had weathered the same storm without incident. Keepers at equally exposed locations reported severe but manageable conditions, with no equipment failures or safety concerns that might have suggested the unprecedented violence apparently experienced at the Flannans. Why had Eilean Mòr suffered catastrophic effects while neighboring installations remained unaffected? Captain Harvey provided crucial testimony about sea conditions during his approach to the lighthouse on December 26. Despite the recent storm, waves around the Flannans had returned to normal winter patterns by the time the Hesperus arrived. The landing platform, while showing damage, remained structurally sound and fully functional. No evidence of recent debris or destruction appeared on the visible portions of the island, suggesting that whatever had occurred had been brief and localized rather than sustained destruction. The ocean's testimony painted a picture of sudden, violent displacement rather than gradual deterioration or extended crisis. 3 men and various lighthouse materials had been removed from Eilean Mòr simultaneously, and with tremendous force, then scattered across miles of treacherous water by tidal action that followed predictable patterns. Yet the mechanism that had generated such force remained completely mysterious. Local fishing crews contributed oral testimony that added disturbing dimensions to the mystery. Several boats reported seeing unusual light phenomena around the Flannans during the storm period, not the regular lighthouse beam, which had ceased operating, but irregular flashes and glowing effects that seemed to emanate from the waters surrounding the islands rather than from the lighthouse itself. The sea had offered its testimony, but like all the evidence in the Flannan Isles case, the ocean's clues raised more questions than they answered. In the decades following the disappearance of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, the Flannan Isles mystery transcended its origins as a simple missing persons case to become one of maritime history's most enduring enigmas. Writers, investigators, and amateur detectives have proposed dozens of theories, each attempting to explain how 3 experienced men could vanish without trace from what should have been an impregnable fortress of stone and steel. The supernatural explanations emerged first, drawing on the Hebridean folklore that had long associated the Flannan Isles with otherworldly forces. Local legends spoke of the islands as thin places where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits grew permeable, allowing entities from other dimensions to cross into our reality. Some theorists suggested that the lighthouse keepers had encountered forces beyond human understanding, disappearing into realms that existed parallel to our own. These mystical theories gained support from the testimony of fishermen who reported seeing unexplained lights around the Flannans during the critical period. Lights that moved in patterns no lighthouse beam would follow and glowed with colors that no oil-burning apparatus could produce. Celtic mythology provided frameworks for understanding such phenomena. Tales of fairy boats that carried mortals away to enchanted islands, stories of sea spirits that lured sailors to their doom, legends of time distortions that could make hours seem like minutes or days vanish in apparent moments. More scientifically minded investigators proposed theories based on geological instability or unprecedented weather phenomena. The Flannan Isles sat above fault lines that had produced seismic activity throughout recorded history, raising possibilities that an earthquake or landslide might have triggered the catastrophic events of December 1900. Perhaps the three keepers had been swept away by a localized tsunami generated by underwater geological collapse, or perhaps they had been buried beneath rockfall triggered by earth tremors. Marine biologists contributed theories involving massive rogue waves, oceanic phenomena that could generate walls of water exceeding 100 feet in height without warning. Such waves, formed by the constructive interference of multiple storm systems, might have overtopped even the highest cliffs of Eilean Mòr, sweeping away everything in their path with irresistible force. Computer modeling suggested that under specific atmospheric conditions, the Flannan Isles geography could focus wave energy in ways that amplified destructive effects far beyond normal storm parameters. Psychological explanations gained credibility as researchers studied the effects of extreme isolation on human behavior. Case studies from other remote installations revealed that even experienced personnel could suffer mental breakdown when confined with the same companions for extended periods, particularly during the stress of severe weather conditions. Perhaps one of the Flannan Isles keepers had experienced psychotic episode, leading to violence that resulted in all three men's deaths. This theory drew support from Thomas Marshall's unfinished letter, which some analysts interpreted as showing signs of deteriorating mental state. His description of increasingly severe sea conditions might have reflected growing paranoia rather than accurate weather observation. His final written words, expressing fear about something he could not complete describing, might have indicated awareness of developing crisis among his companions rather than concern about storm damage. Military historians proposed more sinister explanations, noting that the Flannan Isles disappearance occurred during a period of international tension that would soon erupt into global conflict. The lighthouse's strategic location made it potentially valuable for intelligence gathering or covert operations. Perhaps the three keepers had witnessed activities they were not meant to see, becoming casualties of espionage operations that required absolute secrecy. Foreign vessels regularly passed through these waters, including ships from nations that would soon become enemies of the British Empire. The lighthouse compound's isolation and commanding view of shipping lanes made it an ideal observation post for monitoring naval movements or establishing clandestine communications facilities. If the keepers had discovered such operations, they might have been eliminated to protect state secrets that transcended individual lives. Academic researchers approached the mystery through rigorous analysis of all available evidence, applying forensic techniques and statistical modeling to determine the most probable explanations. Their conclusions consistently pointed toward natural causes, most likely the combination of extreme weather conditions with human error or equipment failure. Yet even these scholarly investigations acknowledged significant gaps in the evidence that prevented definitive resolution. Modern technology has enabled new approaches to investigating the century-old mystery. Satellite imagery reveals details of the Flannan Isles geology that were invisible to earlier investigators. Computer simulations can model weather patterns and wave dynamics with precision impossible during the early 20th century. Marine archaeology techniques allow systematic exploration of underwater areas that might contain physical evidence of the keeper's fate. Yet despite technological advances and continued research interest, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. How did three experienced men vanish simultaneously from a secure location? Why did they apparently abandon their sacred duty to maintain the lighthouse beam? What force was powerful enough to overcome their training, experience, and survival instincts? The mystery has inspired countless books, documentaries, and dramatic interpretations, each adding layers of speculation to a case already burdened with more theories than facts. Popular culture has transformed the Flannan Isles disappearance into a modern legend, ensuring that new generations discover the story and contribute their own attempts at explanation. On a windswept morning in December 2020, exactly 120 years after the disappearance that would define its legacy, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse stood automated and unmanned, its modern LED beacon sweeping across the same treacherous waters that had claimed countless vessels before James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur took up their final watch. The tower that once housed three dedicated keepers now operates through computerized systems that require no human presence, no vulnerable souls to wrestle with isolation, storms, and the inexplicable forces that rule these remote waters. The Northern Lighthouse Board's records, preserved in Edinburgh's archives, contain thousands of pages documenting the investigation that followed the 1900 disappearance. Superintendent Muirhead's final report, filed 6 months after the discovery of the empty lighthouse compound, acknowledged what earlier investigators had struggled to admit. Despite exhaustive examination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis, the fate of the three missing keepers remained completely unknown. Modern forensic techniques have added new dimensions to understanding the mystery without resolving its fundamental questions. DNA analysis of fabric fragments recovered from the waters around Eilean Mòr confirmed that the torn oilskin cloth had indeed belonged to lighthouse equipment, but degradation prevented identification of which keeper might have worn the destroyed garments. Geological surveys revealed no evidence of seismic activity during the critical period, eliminating theories about earthquakes or landslides causing the disappearance. Oceanographic modeling using contemporary data has recreated the storm conditions that battered the Flannans during December 1900, confirming that wave heights could have exceeded 50 feet and wind speeds might have reached hurricane force. Yet similar conditions have occurred dozens of times since then, without producing comparable effects at lighthouse installations throughout the Scottish Islands. Why did the events of December 1900 prove uniquely catastrophic? The lighthouse automation program that began in the 1960s gradually eliminated the human presence that had defined these remote outposts for over a century. The last keeper departed the Flannan Isles in 1971, ending an era when men like Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur stood watch against darkness and storm with nothing but their skill, courage, and dedication to guide them. The mechanical reliability of modern systems has made such human sacrifice unnecessary. But something ineffable was lost when the lighthouse towers fell silent of human voices. Visitors who brave the treacherous journey to Eilean Mòr today find a landscape virtually unchanged from December 1900. The lighthouse compound remains intact, its stone buildings weathered but structurally sound after more than a century of Atlantic storms. The living quarters where the three keepers spent their final days stand empty but preserved, their rooms arranged much as Joseph Moore found them on that chilling Boxing Day morning when the mystery first revealed itself. Tourism to the Flannan Isles remains limited by the same isolation and dangerous waters that defined the lighthouse keeper's existence. The few visitors who make the expensive and difficult journey come seeking connection with one of maritime history's greatest unsolved mysteries, standing where three men lived and worked and ultimately vanished without leaving any definitive trace of their fate. Local guides from Lewis and Harris, many descended from families who knew the missing keepers personally, continue sharing oral traditions that preserve details absent from official records. These stories, passed down through generations of Hebridean fishing families, suggest that the disappearance affected the entire island community in ways that written reports failed to capture. Children grew up hearing whispered tales about the lighthouse that went dark, about three good men who simply ceased to exist, about forces that could reach across 40 miles of ocean to claim lives with impunity. The mystery has achieved something approaching immortality through its resistance to solution. Unlike criminal cases that yield to forensic analysis or historical puzzles that surrender to archival research, the Flannan Isles disappearance remains as baffling today as it was in 1900. Each new generation of investigators brings fresh techniques and perspectives, only to encounter the same fundamental absence of conclusive evidence that frustrated their predecessors. Perhaps this enduring mystery serves a purpose beyond simple historical curiosity. In an age when technology promises to answer every question and surveillance systems record every movement, the Flannan Isles reminds us that some secrets remain inviolate. 3 men walked into history on a December morning over a century ago and never emerged, leaving behind only questions that continue echoing across time. The lighthouse beam still sweeps across those dark waters every night, its automated systems fulfilling the same sacred duty that once belonged to human keepers. Ships still depend on that guidance to navigate safely through channels where countless vessels have been lost to storm and reef. The essential purpose endures, even as the men who once served that purpose have faded into legend. Standing on Eilean Mòr today, watching the Atlantic swells roll endlessly toward Scotland's western shores, visitors can almost hear the voices of 3 lighthouse keepers carried on the wind. James Duckett recording his final weather observations, Thomas Marshall writing his unfinished letter home, Donald MacArthur securing equipment against an approaching storm. They remain present in their absence, guardian spirits of a mystery that time has proven incapable of solving. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking, waiting somewhere in history's shadows to reveal its secrets or guard them for another century.